Welcome to the Design Materials channel. I'm Edson Mafus, architect and professor of architectural design at the School of Architecture, Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, Porto Alegre, Brazil. The theme of this video is the structural grid, an omnipresent element in 20th century architecture that became synonymous with structure. As on other occasions on this channel, there is no intention to exhaust the subject, which would be impossible anyway. The idea is to draw attention to some aspects of the topic that may deserve deeper reflection. The grid can already be found in various forms in previous centuries. Two-dimensional grids are present in Palladio's villas, as Whitcower showed us, on the facades of Renaissance palaces, and as the graphic support on which to place architectural elements introduced in Durand's teaching. These first examples are important here because they illustrate what is not the subject of this video, the two-dimensional grid, a subject already dealt with by other authors. The central theme here is the structural grid made up of pillars, beams, and slabs, a three-dimensional element that transcends its technical commitment and decisively participates in the expression of architecture. The image on the screen does not come from the field of architecture, but it best illustrates the idea of a grid in which there is equivalence between the elements that constitute it. The interest in this system lies in its potential for formal construction. Grids of this type convey a notion of measurement to buildings, as each module represents a floor and thus the whole conveys information about the absolute size of the object. Structural grids have the potential to give unity to a building and serve as a reference for three-dimensional explorations of facade elements, as in the cases of Terrani and Kahn, which we will see ahead. The Spanish architect Juan Antonio Cortés published a study on the history of the two-dimensional grid in the 20th century, in which he defines a typology based on three aspects that constitute it: lines, points, and areas. The most basic grid is homogeneous, usually made up of square units. In each case studied, one of its components predominates. When lines predominate, we are generally faced with large-scale projects, in which lines become corridors, buildings, or even streets. There are well-known historical examples, such as Berlin's Free University by Candilis, Josic, and Woods, or the unbuilt Venice Hospital project by Le Corbusier. What we see here is one of the most recent projects of its kind, an urban sector of an Arab city where lines are elements of circulation. The predominance of the grid dots, the columns, is very clear in the free plans of Le Corbusier and in what Mies van der Rohe produced before moving to the United States. However, considering the grid in the sense I want to discuss here, in the work of these two architects it is incomplete, as only two of its elements are visible, the pillars and the slabs. In other words, the grid is flat, having only material entity as a resistant structure. Le Corbusier himself, inventor of the domino system, did not usually show the structural grid in its entirety, preferring to structure space from the plane. When our focus is on the areas of the grid, it becomes a set of repetitive and self-contained spatial units. That is, the reverse of the free plan. As is well known, one of the central themes in Liu Kan's work was the recovery of the notion of enclosure in architecture. In these two projects, each grid unit is treated as an individualized space. The grid is used selectively, and its homogeneity can be altered by the eventual displacement of some of the units. The grid here is a starting point that does not play a decisive role in the final appearance of the object. However, it was a fundamental support for Khan to recreate the building as a discontinuous set of spaces. The transition from the system of load-bearing walls to the reticular system opened a new period in the history of construction, as previous architecture used the wall as the basis for its construction system. In the beginning, the appearance of this kind of architecture was not congruent with the construction, as elements of historical origin were applied to the metallic structure. In Holabird and Roach's architecture, the resistant structure begins to appear unmediated, although the past persists at the base and at the top. Albert Kahn, an architect known for the many industrial buildings he built for the nascent American automobile industry, converted the grid structure into apparent form, getting rid of all circumstantial ornament. As far as is known, it is in his work that the structural grid is used for the first time in this way. Perret was one of the first to separate structure and walls from the point of view of resistance. But with regard to its position in space, the structure remained linked to the spatial division, at least in residential architecture. In the famous competition for the headquarters of the Chicago Tribune newspaper, the grid as an expressive element made its appearance by the hand of three European architects, Ludwig Hilberseimer, Walter Gropius, and Max Todt. In these projects, one of the most positive characteristics of the three-dimensional grid begins to reveal itself, that of serving as a modulation and measurement system. Note that all additions and subtractions performed in the three projects use entire units. In addition, the grid makes it possible to convert, without mediation, construction elements into architecture, as well as to establish a formal order that emphasizes the height of the floors and the position of the slabs. It is in the Italian architecture of the interwar period that one finds a decisive development of the structural grid as an expressive element. Architects such as Terrani, Lingheri, Cattaneo, and Gardella used it as a fundamental element in a series of interesting projects. In this and the next two projects, the grid structure is the support of the form and its main element. Interior and exterior are solved with analogous solutions. As pillars and beams have similar dimensions, the grid loses much of the reference to its resistant role and plays an equally important role in the visual structure of the buildings. In the project for a Congress Hall in Rome, Terrani proposes one of the first structural grids in which the distance between columns is not always the same, alternating narrow modules with wide ones. In the competition for a tower in an important square in Milan, Ignacio Gardella uses the grid to expand the scale of the object and make it more compatible with the public space being proposed. After a few decades in which it aroused little interest, the structural grid reappears with full force in Louis Kahn's work, being the main reference both outside and inside the Yale Center for British Art. Its formal system is based on the relationship between the grid and its filling: metallic panels on the facades and oak panels on the interior. There are many cases in which the structural grid, although present throughout the building, only appears as such on the facades, disappearing inside as it coincides with the elements that subdivide the space, as Perret did at the beginning of the 20th century. This can be seen in works ranging from Auto in the middle of the century to recent works in which the grid becomes an element to solve the facade but is not visually present in the interior. When the grid is applied without variations to large extensions of facade, there is a risk of generating bland buildings without much visual interest, as is the case of Chipperfield's City of Justice in Barcelona. This is not the case with this complex by the German architect Max Dudler, in which slight variations to each building give the whole a variety that is more in line with what normally happens in urban spaces we are used to. The structural grid is often thought to be best suited for buildings with a prismatic shape that approaches the cube, such as Kahn's at Yale and this one by O.M. Ungers. But, as in the towers proposed for the Chicago Tribune in 1922, in the 1980s, three-dimensional grids began to appear in a series of buildings composed of additive and asymmetrical forms, as well as in subtractive compositions in which the modules of the grid become outdoor or multi-height spaces. In Isosaki's design, shown here, the grid is limited to a single floor for most of its asymmetrical arrangement. A contemporary example of the use of a structural grid that does not define the contours of an elementary solid. In Eisenman and Graves's projects, the grid is the reference, a stabilizing element that allows for a series of formal manipulations around it. The use of the structural grid as an expressive element reaches its maximum interest when it influences the exterior and the interior with equal intensity, as in another example by Max Dudler, in whose production it is difficult to find a project that is not organized by way of a grid. Something similar, albeit less rigorous, happens in this project by Foster and Partners. Perhaps the most interesting topic of this brief discussion is the creative potential that the three-dimensional grid offers, as a visual reference and constant material for formal operations, which will be all the more relevant as they are related to the uses of each building. In the festival building, Ando does not treat all units as interior spaces. Several units act as exterior spaces and others are combined inside as vertical voids. On the other hand, the architect also ventures outside the cube defined by the grid to accommodate vertical circulation. A contemporary version of the same strategy, the prismatic exterior shape is clearly identifiable by the presence of the grid elements, even though part of the cubic units in each pavement are open or empty spaces. In this house, the architects take advantage of the ease with which concrete structures accept cantilevers to create a configuration that resembles the trees among which it is situated. Each floor is larger than the lower one by means of equal overhangs on all four sides. Here, a multi-purpose building with a rectangular plan, the authors also resort to cantilevers. Some outer pillars are removed, but the grid remains identifiable. The last two projects to be discussed present solutions that introduce complexity to the theme of the three-dimensional grid, without compromising in any way the uses that the two buildings should facilitate. In the case of this university building, we are faced with an unconventional grid, whose depth is just one unit, with pillars on the edges of the plan, configuring an interior space of total flexibility. The main interest of this project lies in its facades, in which the variable distance between the pillars alters the grain of the building's surface. On the ground floor, the distance between pillars is 3 times that of the two immediately above. From the fourth floor upwards, the distance between pillars is half of the ones below, which represents 1/6 of the distance between pillars on the ground floor plan. In the last stage of this transformation of the facade, the pillars go beyond the last floor and, in combination with the cross beams, generate an exterior room that crowns the volume. Both ends of the building are cantilevered to provide more permeability to the rectangular courtyard in which it is located. What could have been a rectangular block without much interest has become a very interesting object from a visual point of view, in addition to satisfying what is requested from a functional point of view. The connoisseur of architecture identifies the relationship of several of its formal episodes to modern precedents, but the way in which they were absorbed by this project qualifies it as exemplary. The last project is an atypical case, in the sense that the structural grid constitutes the building in the most radical way possible, but is partially covered by a translucent cover that is not parallel to its facades. The competition drawings revealed more of the grid than what appears in the built object, a prismatic volume defined by a homogeneous grid of 8 by 8 by 26 cubic units. This volume undergoes some excavations, so to speak, to accommodate the large spaces necessary for a theater, which remain hidden from inside the grid. From the outside, it is difficult to perceive how much the grid is predominant in the interior perception of this building. To circulate inside this, it is to walk all the time inside the grid, one of the most characteristic elements of architecture in the 20th and early 21st centuries. Thank you very much for watching one more video. I hope you come back for the next one.